Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
It's been said that out of the heart, the mouth speaks. I have spoken out of my heart. I have spoken a lot about supercomputers. I have spoken about the massively parallel processing supercomputer that I invented. I have spoken since the 1970s and spoken about how I was the first eyewitness to the experimental discovery of how and why a new ensemble of the slowest processors that computes together as one seamless, cohesive, massively parallel processing supercomputer is a new internet de facto. The words I spoke came from my discoveries, heart and brain. Those words will define me for posterity. To witness a discovery that has rich, fatal, and far-reaching consequences is like walking into a forest and witness a lot of leaves fall on your head. In a nutshell, this is my supercomputer story and my contribution to the development of the fastest supercomputer. I began programming supercomputers on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, United States. 2 years later, and in 1976, and at the National Computer Conference in New York City, a panel of supercomputer experts warned that parallel processing machines are, quote unquote, large and clumsy. That panel of supercomputer experts ridiculed, mocked, and rejected the then unproven technology of the massively parallel processing supercomputer. That panel of supercomputer experts offhandedly dismissed the technology of parallel processing as a huge waste of everybody's time. In the 1980s, I was dismissed from my research teams and dismissed for advocating the massively parallel processing supercomputer. In the 1980s, I could count the number of programmers that were massively parallel processing and count them on my fingers. But I needed only one finger to count them because I was the only person that was logged on 24/7 and logged on to the most massively parallel processing supercomputer ever manufactured. Today, the market value of that massively parallel processing supercomputer that I programmed alone has appreciated by a factor of 1,000. That new supercomputer that I programmed alone now costs the budget of a small nation. I experimentally programmed the new massively parallel processing supercomputer, and I programmed it alone. And I did so because the 25,000 vector processing supercomputer scientists of the 1980s were heeding the textbook warnings that it will forever remain experimentally impossible to harness the total theorized supercomputing power of an ensemble of thousands of processors. The supercomputing community's abandonment of the massively parallel processing supercomputer unintentionally created a certain cachet of exclusivity, and did so because they were de facto excluded from the frontier of human knowledge that was defined by the massively parallel processing supercomputer of the 1980s and earlier. The supercomputer textbooks of the 1970s and 80s cited Amdahl's law that was erroneously formulated in April 1967 and cited that incorrect law to argue that massively parallel processing across 64 binary thousand processors will forever remain impossible, or at least remain impractical. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I began supercomputing on June 20, 1974 at age 19 in Corvallis, Oregon, United States. Back in the 1970s and 80s, the core technology that drives both the modern computer and the massively parallel processing supercomputer of today and drives them at their fastest speeds was ridiculed, mocked, and rejected in scientific research. A scientist that discovered something new that other scientists did not know asserts his or her authority over his or her discovery, and do so by authoring an in-depth research report on his or her discovery and then giving a companion series of lectures that are shared with everybody in the world, including those on YouTube. My series of lectures on my contributions to the development of the modern supercomputer are posted at youtube.com/Emeagwali. The vector processing supercomputer scientists of the 1980s that I asked to review my 1,057-page research report on the new massively parallel processing supercomputer that I was programming ridiculed, mocked, and rejected my experimental discoveries and inventions. In late 1989, when my experimental discovery won the top prize in the field of supercomputing and began to make the news headlines across major US newspapers, those supercomputer scientists that ridiculed, mocked, and rejected my research report confessed to news journalists that they threw my 1,057-page supercomputer research report into the trash. After my experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, those supercomputer scientists that ridiculed, mocked, and rejected my discovery of the precursor of the modern supercomputer realized that the history of the supercomputer is unfolding right before their eyes, and that they were not a part of the story of the development of the modern supercomputer. In 1989, And after I won the top prize in supercomputing, those supercomputer scientists that ridiculed, mocked, and rejected my experimental discovery of parallel processing became envious of my new fame and ran back to me to beg for a second copy of my 1,057-page supercomputer research report that they previously threw into the trash. The news headlines described me as the African supercomputer wizard, and did so because my experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer that occurred across a new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled commonly available processors, and that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, was described as the wizardry act of making the previously impossible to compute possible to compute. What was erroneously written in the supercomputer textbooks of the 1940s through 80s was that it will forever remain impossible to harness the potential power of parallel processing. The June 14, 1976 issue of the Computer World magazine interviewed supercomputer experts that were attending the 1976 National Computer Conference in New York City. Those supercomputer experts were asked if it will ever be possible to invent how to use parallel processing, or how to use an ensemble of thousands of processors, and how to use them to execute the fastest computations across that ensemble. The unanimous opinion of those supercomputer scientists was summed up in an article in the June 14, 1976 issue of the Computer World magazine. E. Drake Lundell Jr., who was the computer industry editor for the Computer World magazine, wrote an article titled, quote, "Research in Parallel Processing, questioned as waste of time," unquote. Looking back retrospectively, the reason I was not discouraged from massively parallel processing across an ensemble of 65,536 processors was that I was then only 21 years old, and therefore I had the years to waste. It seemed like I was wasting 15 years onward of age 19, and wasting that prime decade and a half pursuing parallel processing that then seemed impossible. I spent the 13 years onward of 1976 conducting my supercomputer research and researching as a lone wolf at supercomputer centers that were across the United States. In the 1970s and 80s, I had a presence in US supercomputer centers. I programmed supercomputers in Corvallis, Oregon. I programmed supercomputers in Pasadena, California. I programmed supercomputers in Chicago, Illinois. I programmed supercomputers for 16 years, and I was the first person to be referred to as a supercomputer scientist. As an extreme scale computational physicist at the frontier of the supercomputer, my research focus was on how to invent a massively parallel processing supercomputer that I defined and outlined by a new ensemble of 65,536 tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors, and how to invent, how to reduce 180 computing years on only one processor that is solving the toughest problem in extreme scale computational physics to just one supercomputing day across my new internet that is a new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled processors that are harnessed to solve the same initial boundary value problem in modern calculus and or mathematical physics.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.